Dr. Paul Miles, and I am here with Dr. Titus Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is an archaeologist, and he is the author of the recent book, Unearthing the Bible, 101 Archaeological Discoveries that Bring the Bible to Life. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. Looking forward to it.
So tell us about the book. What's inside? What prompted you to write this?
So the book is basically about artifacts or objects, ancient objects that connect to the Bible. And I chose 101 of them that I thought were the most important and also the most interesting. I moved through the Bible chronologically. So each chapter is divided up into a specific time period or period of biblical history. For example, it begins with creation, the flood, and the patriarchs. So information about books like Genesis and Job are in there. And then we go into the Exodus and the conquest and the kingdom and so on. So I've got both Old and New Testaments, and tried to use a lot of artifacts that are also not so well known and yet still important, and some that are controversial, and to explain the possible benefits of some of these artifacts and what their discoveries imply about the Bible.
Okay, very interesting, very interesting. Now, what's your background? What got you interested in archaeology? How did you get into biblical archaeology of all the archaeological topics out there?
Even back in elementary school, I really liked history. And then one of my teachers gave me a book on Heinrich Schliemann and the excavation of Troy. And that was sort of my introduction to archaeology. I didn't really know how these historians got that kind of information before. And then I read this book and I realized that they actually went to these ancient locations, these city ruins, and they excavated the place. They dug up these buildings and these artifacts. And so that really intrigued me. And as I continued reading, as I got older, I found that there were a lot of archaeological discoveries that connected to the Bible, some which helped us to understand the context better or illuminated particular passages, people, places, others that confirmed the accuracy of historical events in the Bible. So I decided finally I wanted to study that in the university, and I just kept going. Did bachelor's, 2 masters, and a PhD, and was working on excavations. So that's kind of how I got to the point where I eventually wrote this book.
Okay, very cool. Now, you mentioned that some of these artifacts are not so well known, some are controversial. Would you say that of the 101 archaeological artifacts, that you have one or a few that are your favorites above the others?
Yeah, I do have a few favorites, definitely.
Okay.
Some from Old Testament, some from New Testament.
Well, what are some of your favorites?
Well, one of the most important for the Old Testament, in my view anyhow, is the Tel Dan stele, which when it was discovered was the first inscription, ancient inscription, that was recognized as referring to King David as a real person. Before that, a lot of historians, archaeologists, even biblical scholars were starting to say that David was just a mythical king. He never existed. And because there was no archaeological evidence for him that had been discovered yet. And then during this dig in 1993, they uncovered this stele from the Arameans that listed some Israelite kings, and then it referred to them as under the house of David. And so all of a sudden, there is this evidence of David as the founder of the Israelite dynasty of kings. So that's an incredibly important one, and just also very interesting in that it's enemies of Israel, the Arameans, who actually talk about all these kings, including David.
That's fascinating that it's the enemies, right? Obviously, it's his friends that wrote the book. So to get confirmation from the other side is that's something else, I imagine. Do you have a particular favorite from the New Testament side of things?
Yeah, from the New Testament, I'd say that my favorite right now, anyway, is called the Nazareth inscription. And this is something that I think connects to Jesus and the resurrection. So if you recall in Matthew, the end of Matthew, it talks about how the guards, the Roman guards who were at the tomb, they go and they talk to the religious leaders. And they're told, here's some money, go spread the story that the disciples of Jesus stole the body. And if there's any problem, we'll cover for you. So that seems to be the story that was spread around by the Romans. Well, if you look at the Nazareth inscription, this is something that popped up in Nazareth. We don't know the exact excavation find spot, but it seems to be from early in the reign of Emperor Claudius. So maybe around 41 AD, possibly a few years later than that, but not long after the time of Jesus. And it describes this new death penalty for anyone that steals a body from a specific type of tomb with wicked intent, it says. And so it's a stone carved tomb that's sealed by this stone, just like the tomb of Jesus. And these are not the kind of tombs that Romans or Greeks would use. And of course, they also employed cremation often. So it's talking about the same kind of tomb and burial as Jesus, and it's talking about people stealing a body with some kind of nefarious intent behind it, and then it gives the death penalty if that happens. So they seem to wanted to put a stop to this and went to extreme measures to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again, or maybe even to kind of stop the story in its tracks.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Now those are pretty big deals. The existence of David and the resurrection. Those are huge to the biblical storyline. Are there any artifacts that have kind of emerged to confirm the smaller details of the Bible as well, or is it just the big things that are
Oh
hard
yeah,
to miss?
for sure. There's a couple others in the Old Testament period that I really like. One is called a Pim Weight. So it's just
A
this
Pam weight?
small, yeah, it's a small stone, it's a weight, and it has an inscription on it naming the weight Pim. Now, this is something that appears once in the Old Testament, and translators didn't really know what it was. They saw this word Pim, and it was in the context of some agricultural instruments, and they thought that it was some kind of tool maybe. So they had different views on translating it, right? But then at Gezer, one of these was found, and subsequently more of them. But once it was found, they understood that it was a weight that was equal to 2/3 of a shekel, and so they were able to translate the passage correctly. And also, what we understood is that this was a weight that went out of use early in the kingdom period. That's why people didn't know how to translate it. It wasn't even translated correctly in the Septuagint. And so this is also something that, besides just a little interesting piece, it tells us that the author there was contemporary and knew about this weight, and yet later on in biblical history there was no knowledge of this. It was lost.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I guess that kind of attests to the antiquity of the original text, being as how the weight had gone out of usage. People apparently forgot about it in antiquity. So
Right. Yeah. Rather than being written like 700 years later, it suggests that that text was actually written around the time that it occurred. So.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned that some of your artifacts here are a little controversial. Could you give any examples of what's happening on the controversial front?
Yeah, actually, the Nazareth inscription has become controversial
Really?
recently, only within the last several months or year. There was an article that tested a piece of this inscription, and it suggested that the marble itself came from the island of Kos, which is off the western coast of Turkey. And so the scholars who were running this project, they suggested that the inscription actually was connected to Nicias of Kos, this tyrant of the Greek island there. And his tomb was desecrated publicly after his death because the people hated him. So that was their suggestion. But what we found in research is that the marble is actually imported, or was imported, into Israel and Judea from many other places, including the island of Kos. There's a quarry there. And in fact, Herod is known to have imported marble from that very place. There's inscriptions of Herod the Great and Herod Agrippa found there. So really, it just kind of tells us about the origin and some of the trade routes that were going on. I don't think that it discounts the connection to Jesus.
Interesting. What other kind of controversies are there out there? Has anything else evolved since the book came out?
Ossuary is one.
Oh, I'm sorry, say again?
The James Ossuary, that's one. So there was a long antiquities trial involving this ossuary with an inscription that says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So just looking at that, obviously it drew a lot of attention right away because of the names and the relationship of those names. But the Israel Antiquities Authority, they alleged that it was a forgery, and it went into a trial that lasted for several years. And there were other artifacts involved in this trial. At the end, the charges were dropped, the artifacts were returned, and there was no evidence really of forgery. In fact, a lot of scholars, after looking at it in extreme detail, thought that it was completely genuine. But many people are not aware of that part of it because they just heard about the forgery trial or heard the allegations about it. But really, the detailed analysis suggests that it is an artifact that is completely genuine from the first century, and quite possibly is our only inscription right now that refers to Jesus from the first century. So it's controversial, but it's also very important.
Interesting. It seems that the more important something is, the more value that it can have, the more scrutiny and attack that it will come under.
Right. I mean, even the Tel Dan stele that I mentioned before, there are actually some scholars who try to say that is a forgery, or they try to say that it's not talking about David. So people will go to extreme lengths to try to fight or suppress this stuff. I mean, that's not the mainstream view by any means, but there are definitely people out there who aren't just sort of internet crazies who still try to say that kind of stuff.
Now, for those of us who are not trained archaeologists that are interested in the topic simply because it's an interesting topic, what kind of wisdom would you advise for making sure that you're staying within the bounds of good archaeology and not getting out into the internet crazies? Because there's a lot of that out there. There's internet crazy for plenty.
Yeah, your sources, checking the sources is going to be one helpful thing, and I say that in terms of have these findings been published in an archaeology journal or some kind of academic journal? Have they been published in a book? Have other people seen them, looked at them, and weighed in on these? Kind of, you can scrutinize the lines of argument. They may come to a certain conclusion, right? What's the data that connects to that conclusion? Is it logical? Does it actually exist? Can you look at it? Because a lot of things are claimed like, oh, here's the Red Sea crossing, but nothing has been published about the supposed findings. You can't look at that kind of stuff. There's not really agreement at all within any sector archaeology. So some of the stuff I think you can look and scrutinize and kind of figure out maybe this is not quite what they're presenting. It's not quite as solid. Other stuff you should be able to double check basically and see if the data, if the material is actually legit and if the argument is logical.
Okay. What are some books and journals that you have found helpful? If I come across something on the internet and I want to say, is this a crazy or is this a normie? What's a good source for me to look at?
So in some of my classes and as recommendations for books getting into biblical archaeology, I often recommend a couple of books for the Old Testament. The first would be just titled Archaeology and the Old Testament by Hirth, and then also On the Reliability of the Old Testament by Kitchen. For the New Testament, there's Archaeology of the New Testament by McCrae. There are quite a few books discussing the time of Jesus, but those kind of vary in quality. Some are good, some are not. And then you get into some more specialized topics, whether they're looking at, say, Daniel, or looking at Paul and so forth. As far as journals go, I think if you go to the older biblical archaeology reviews, those tend to be better than the newer ones for sure. There's also,
what classifies old in this sense?
I would say anything from probably the early 90s and earlier seem to be better. There's also an older journal called the Biblical Archaeologist that went out of print or changed to another journal, and it's got a lot of good material in it too. Occasionally you'll find some good archaeology journals, Archaeology of the Bible articles in theological journals like Journal for the Evangelical Theological Society, or there's one I read in the Master's Seminary Journal, Bibliothesis Sacra. They've all published, 1, 2, 3 at least over the years. And then there's also a journal or magazine called Bible and Spade that also has usually some really good articles in it. The older ones are more technical or more robust. Some of the newer ones are targeted toward more of a general audience, but they've got a lot of good material and they keep things up to date too. So.
Okay. Speaking of audience, what's the target audience for your book?
The target audience for my book really is a general audience. It's not specifically geared toward scholars. And, I did that on purpose because I wanted people to know about these archaeological discoveries. And I realized that they're probably not going to jump into journal articles or a technical book or even kind of like a textbook style. There are a lot of pictures in it. I mean, there's pictures of every artifact in there because, one, I think that's really important in archaeology for people to be able to see what they're looking at. Not only does it help you instead of trying to visualize and imagine it yourself, but it also shows this is actually a real thing because here's a photograph of it. It's not just something that maybe someone claimed existed and now they're writing about it. So really anybody should be able to pick it up. There are some terms in there that will be unfamiliar, but there's a glossary, there's footnotes, and you might have to look up a couple of words or something like that every once in a while, but it's definitely fine for the general public, general student even.
Cool. The pictures are something that I've really enjoyed. Of course, here in Eastern Europe, it's hard to get a paper book in, so I got the Kindle version. And man, you've got some really high quality images. You can zoom in there and look right at the lettering on some of those documents. Very, very good stuff.
Yeah, that was the intent, to get high quality photos. So like you said, you could actually see the inscriptions on the artifacts that have, those little letters.
Did you take these pictures yourself?
Yeah, I took most of them, the vast majority actually. There's a few public domain in there, but I try to have all my own photos so that I don't run into the problem of trying to track them down and do licensing.
Mhm. Taking the pictures, I imagine, is a task that you've probably had to travel around a bit to get into the same room as these things. Where all have you been in the authorship of the book?
Yeah, that's true. There's been a lot of traveling involved to getting these pictures and a lot of others of other artifacts and sites. During the writing of the book, I wasn't traveling much to do photography because I already had all the, or almost all the photographs there. There were a few that I wanted to get some higher quality of, so I went to a few museums in Europe, about uh, not quite a year ago, and to just sort of finish up some stuff. And then also when I was over in Israel, um, about a year ago, or a little over a year ago, I doubled up on some things just to make sure, because I had gotten a new camera. But really, I mean, they're from museums all over Europe and the Middle East and America. Um, and I think that's basically it for this book. None from any other locations, but still quite a few countries and cities.
Very cool. Now, speaking of your photography, you have an Instagram account that I'm a huge fan of. Love seeing your Instagram pop up. Could you tell our audience a bit about your Instagram work?
Yeah, so this was something that I actually started before the book. I had wanted to write some kind of book like this that was focusing on biblical artifacts and showing all the pictures. But I decided that I was going to start posting things like that online. So I have archaeological sites and or buildings and artifacts that I will post on Instagram with a little snippet about what they are and how they connect to history in the Bible, and then a passage from scripture that either mentions something directly, or it's an indirect connection. So I try to keep up on that. It's probably only about once a week now. Sometimes it gets delayed a little bit, but biblical archaeology, you can search for that and find it. And I'm always trying to post new stuff. So I'm always researching, looking into what have I not put out there yet, or if there's a new finding, try to put something out about that also.
Now, recently I've seen that you've put some posts out there relating to some South American discoveries as well. I believe I saw one about the temple structures out there. How
Right.
is that world related to the world of the Bible?
Yeah, indirectly, but I find all those ancient civilizations very interesting because occasionally you can see connections that go back to the Middle East or the ancient Near East, especially. For example, there's these temples throughout Central and South America that look very much like the ziggurats that we find in ancient Mesopotamia. And to me, it suggests a connection between those cultures, like that the people kept moving out of the center, out of the Fertile Crescent, but they brought with them some of their technology and their past knowledge. And I think that it's just interesting. It doesn't really connect to anything other than when the Bible talks about the Table of Nations, basically, those migrations. But it also shows all the connections between ancient people. I mean, there's the example that often gets brought up too about how there are all these flood stories known from around the world. And I think that's along the same kind of lines, is that the event was known and recorded at the center, right, in Mesopotamia, where civilization started. But then as people moved away from there, some of them brought knowledge of these ancient stories with them, and they recorded them later on.
Okay. Uh, if the Bible is true, as we believe it is, that's certainly the kind of thing that you would expect to see.
Right.
Would you say that the field of archaeology is making positive contributions to the field of hermeneutics and how to read the Bible?
Yeah, I personally think that archaeology can be very useful for hermeneutics, for biblical interpretation, and not just for general background context either. I mean, that is helpful and it's interesting, but there are many cases where knowing the specifics of that time period, that culture, the city that is being discussed, or where, say, an epistle is written from, that really helps us to understand the perspective of the author and sometimes tell us specifically what he's really talking about. We talked earlier about the Pim Weight, so that's just one little example. That's a translational issue, but it's helpful. Obviously, it's not earth-shattering in its implications, but there are other examples like that where it will help us to understand the meaning of a word. But then we have some other things like in the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And the more that we know about Corinth, the better we're able to understand some of what is behind what Paul's talking about. For example, when he discusses the food offered to idols, or the food that had been sacrificed to idols. And then archaeology digs up these temples that they had feasts to the gods in, and it digs up the meat market, and we can kind of put things in the context of where's the synagogue in the city, or connect that to Corinth and Acts. Where's the bema? What did that look like? And how far away was the synagogue? And so it helps in terms of understanding the whole picture a little bit better. And sometimes it even helps us to interpret specific words or even verses a little bit better.
Okay, very interesting. Now, you mentioned the various flood myths that are around the world. In your book, you talk about some of the pagan creation stories. I hear a lot of people appealing to pagan text and saying, see, in the ancient Near East, they often wrote mythological tales to describe the creation or whatever, and the Bible is just another one of these within the genre of myth. What would be a good response to something like that?
Well, first of all, my perspective on those various creation and flood stories is that they were events that people remembered them and they wrote them down. And so to me, especially with the flood stories, that's easier for people to get a grasp on, that a flood happened and people remembered it and wrote down about it. But the Genesis account is a little bit different. And now, if we're talking specifically, though, about the creation stories, well, if you read the different texts, if you read the text in Genesis, that creation account, versus these other ancient Near Eastern accounts, you can see very clear differences. You can see how unique the Genesis account is. So that has one thing going for it, so to speak, is the uniqueness of it. But in terms of saying, is it just another mythical account, or is it correct, or is it the correct account? I think you have to go to other evidence for that. You've got to look at things like intelligent design and creation science and fine-tuning and the anthropic principle, and all these different things in science on the one hand, and on the other, in terms of, is the biblical account correct? You've got to look at the testimony of Scripture and see how the evidence shows that the Bible is accurate. And you can do that through archaeology, but you run into an issue with creation, obviously, because people weren't there, right? So you can't say, well, oh, Moses was there and he recorded it. No, you have to look at things like, is there evidence that the text is divinely inspired? And so that gets into the realm of fulfilled prophecy. And of course, we can look at history through history and archaeology, and we can see how these prophecies were written before the events occurred. And that implies then the divine inspiration of the text. And archaeology just factors into that in terms of establishing the historical events and also the manuscripts so that we can see that the words that we have written down actually predate the events themselves, showing that they were prophecies, not kind of an after the fact thing.
Very nice, very nice. Now, if someone wants to get a copy of the book, or if we want to follow you on Instagram, how do we learn more? How do we get in touch? How do we get a copy? What do we do from here?
You can get a copy on Amazon, for instance. I mean, it's available other places too, but I know a lot of people order from there. It's quick and easy. You can get it in print, or like you did, you can get it on Kindle. And then on Instagram, you can just search biblical archaeology and follow those posts there. And there's also a link to my website where eventually I will be posting more biblical archaeology related material.
Okay. Oh, I haven't asked about the website. Tell us about the website.
The website just connects to an archaeological institute, and that the intent there is to have a lot of resources available, things like longer articles or links to other sites or studies that contribute to the field of biblical archaeology. You know, pictures also, there are pictures on there too, and hopefully at some point in the future it will be a good resource. It's under construction at the moment.
Okay, interesting. Now, do you do much technical writing? I read your chapter on the nomads of Yahweh, and then I Googled a little bit further, and I found a really cool, more scholarly article that she wrote about the particular hieroglyph that's more of a whip than what they thought it was before, right? Very cool stuff. Do you have a lot of technical stuff that you put out there, or is it more on the layman level?
I try to publish, more of the technical articles.
Okay.
When I'm writing journal articles. I've done both, and I think it's good to do both because you want to address more than just the scholarly community. You want everybody else who's not in that field to be able to read about it and access it. But we do, I think, need to also address the scholarly community because
Absolutely.
one, we just got to get the full evidence out there and explain all those arguments. But two, in academia, that's where there's sort of this trickle down effect that whatever is the viewpoint and the knowledge in academia, that's going to eventually get down to the general public because they're going to be teaching students and writing books and doing documentaries and so forth. So if academia has a totally different view than the general public, then there's going to be a conflict there. So it's got to be addressed.
Cool. Very good. I'm glad that we have a good conservative guy like you that's hitting all the levels like that. Is there a journal that you typically write for, or do you work with different guys? I don't know how that works.
I've worked with quite a few actually.
Okay, cool.
It really just depends on topics and what's available.
Now, before we started the interview, you mentioned that you're working on another book. Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, the next book is a book on the archaeology of Jesus. So I'm just focusing on archaeology connected to the Gospels and the life of Jesus and going through it in a chronological order as best I can. Obviously, when you put all four Gospels together, there's some places where you're not sure on the ordering of events exactly, but trying my best on that and using insight from a lot of scholars of the past on that. And really just trying to have a comprehensive resource that addresses all the archaeology that we know about Jesus, or at least all the major archaeology. It's not going to be able to go into the most extreme detail on every topic, but it should discuss essentially everything that connects to Jesus, as far as sites that we know, artifacts that connect to his life and the Gospels, a little bit on manuscripts even, or ancient writings that talk about Jesus, and a lot of pictures, some maps, so help with visuals there for people. And again, this is going to be targeted to a general audience, but I think that this will require a little bit more concentration to read, because you're going to have to get through a whole chapter rather than just 2 or 3 pages on a particular artifact. But it's not restricted to academics either.
Well, that's great. I'm looking forward to that one. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Titus. I'll drop some links on the page to the book. Do you have any final words for us?
I would say, if you're interested in biblical history and archaeology, then get out there and start reading some of those recommended resources. Explore on your own. Just always have in your mind that you need to be thinking critically, because you're going to run into a lot of different perspectives and claims. But don't let that discourage you. There's plenty of strong evidence out there. Just takes a little bit of work and evaluation.
Cool. Thank you so much. This has been Dr. Titus Kennedy, author of Unearthing the Bible, 101 Archaeological Discoveries that Bring the Bible to Life. Thank you so much, Titus.
Thank you.